Hello there and welcome to this Embarcadero Developer Skill Sprint. My name is Stephen Ball and I'm a Senior Technical Sales Consultant here at Embarcadero, but I'm also the Associate Product Manager for InterBase. And today it's my pleasure to take you through InterBase XE7 and change views. Now, if you'd like to find out more about what I do, more about change views and other stuff that I'm working on, then please do follow me on Twitter at Delphi and you'll be able to kind of pick up from me there and my blog a number of things around InterBase and change views, which I'll put a reference to at the end of this session. So for the skill sprint, we are going to be using InterBase XE7. I'm going to be focusing specifically on doing this with a Windows project. This does work across all of the platforms for collecting data and pulling it down to a client device. And this works with RAD Studio and with Delphi with C++ Builder and also with that method. So all of those platforms are available, but you do need to download first a copy of the InterBase XE7 Developer Edition if you'd like to have a play with this, or the Trial Edition. For those of you who've not been on a skill sprint before, these are 20-minute topics and we're going to just get straight into it, deep dive in. There'll be time for Q&A at the end. If you do want to ask any questions, then please do use your GoToWebinar control panel and just ask as we go. So let's start off with what is a change view. So change views are a new subscription-based model to subscribe to data and identify what data has changed in the database. So you can actually subscribe to the remote database with a tracking ID, and then when you come back later on, it will tell you what has changed since you last took that data. Now this has obviously got great implications for keeping client-side caches up to date and is especially important when you have specific data that you want to query. And you can use change views with SQL language to specifically restrict to specific data that you're interested in the table as well. So subscriptions can run both during a connection and spanning connections. So the really important thing here is that you do not need to have a session that's managed on the server or on the client side to actually keep this running. The only thing you have is a tracking ID and you bring that back later on with you to say this is me, and that will then allow you to connect up to where you were. Each subscriber can have multiple devices, so each user in the database can basically provide multiple tracking IDs. So you could keep your iPhone and your Android phone and your tablet and your laptop all up to date at different times connecting in to collect the data. And that means that you don't need to worry about, well, this is my username, now which device am I on? The two work in parallel to provide great flexibility. So if we start off with a quick example here of why change views are important. If we think moving data costs a lot of money, if we don't have our clients' caches up to date, we get a performance hit. And over time, as we're changing data in the central database, now this is just a one-way example, but we can see that every time we're having to pull down a lot of data packets just to mirror and pick up what is going on the server. So in this example here, 23 packets. Now using change views, we're able to identify specifically what deltas have changed at a field level. So using that, we're then able to package that up to provide back just what we need to the client side. And this works great with FireUI, and we've got some new stuff that we're going to be showing you through today. It's a sneak preview of some of the updates that are coming in the next release of RAD Studio and App Method. But let's just carry on for a moment talking about how change views work. I say basically we have a subscription, a concept of subscription, and that subscription allows you to subscribe to specific columns in a database. And a subscription can be spanning multiple tables. It can have a selection of fields or all fields, so you can subscribe to the table or you can subscribe to specific fields in a table. You can subscribe to insert, update or delete statements, changes, should I say. And once you've built the subscription, it's then ready to be subscribed to. So you can have multiple users use the same subscription to collect their data. So once you've defined how a subscription works, people can come subscribe to it. A bit like, the newspaper says, hey, we've got a sports section that you can subscribe to. You can then say, oh, I'd like to subscribe to that. And then they say, well, we've got this section for current affairs. Oh, I'd like to subscribe to that. And you can run multiple subscriptions. Each subscriber can have obviously multiple devices, and say this is basically defined by a tracking ID, which is up to the size of a GUID is a valid tracking ID. One of the very important things with change views is that we wanted to make sure that when you're connected up to a central data store and you're providing back the changes that you may have tracked locally, that when you ask for the changes to the data next time, you don't get sent those changes back. So that was a key requirement here, is that when you're connected into your session, you can fetch the changes from the server, bring yourself up to date, and then you can actually post your changes in. And then when you say, right, what's changed, you don't get told about what you've posted in. And that's achieved through without having to do any database locking, because we're doing this using the asset compliant stuff that's been around through transactions with InterBase for a very, very long time. So this is a very proven architecture. And I say because of the way we work with this, we're actually doing something you can't do with transactions. We're spanning this across connections. So it really is about connecting back in as if you'd been at a specific point in time in the past, and then asking for what has changed. And the great thing about this is it doesn't matter how many devices you get connected in, the impact on the database is the same. There's no additional logging, there's no additional fields that need to be added to the database. It just works, which is pretty cool. So why change views? Well, one of the alternatives and a traditional way of tracking changes on a central database has been triggers. And with triggers, you kind of end up running to the point that they're just not effective for scaling. If you've got changes that are being made and you need to then track those changes for the destinations they need to go to, if you've got 10,000 destinations, you may find every insert then logs 10,000 times that it's got to go out to different places. And this can be really verbose. It's very hard to query using triggers what specifically is different. You've got to then pass the log table before you can then link that back to the main data. So your statements get very hard to work with as well, and take a lot longer to run. So triggers for logging changes is very, it's very suited for small synchronization replication type setups. Now, this trigger approach is something that IB Replicator, the old replication engine, used to use, and I know an awful lot about that, having done a huge amount of deployments with that in the past. And it does get to a point that it does struggle. With change views, however, we're just tracking at the field level what has changed. So we're not doing an audit trail, but we're actually saying, right, these are the fields that have specifically changed since you last asked for data. And we do this with near zero database speed effect, absolute minimal on-disk size changes, with field granularity. We also allow you to query with your statements for specific data, which is immensely useful. So you could do select count from table to find out the number of records that have changed. And because of the way that it's defined out, it's very scalable to having a huge volume of devices connected in to your central database where everyone's subscribing. One of the other alternatives is date fields. Date fields can really verbose out your database, especially if you need to track at a field level. And they add additional risk because you need to be updating those dates and times. It's very hard to manage because you often need to do locking on the tables to make sure that when somebody's making sets of changes that you're then not kind of reading and writing dates in the middle of things. It can be very, very complicated to kind of work through. And this brings to a lot of risk. With change views, I say it's near zero database speed effect. It's very, very easy to add to your database after you finish your development. So it's not a case of, right, I need to define fields to track all this as I'm going. You just define your application in the way that you need that data and then go add the tracking later on. So right now, I know what I need to use. These are the bits that I need to use. So as you're building the application and you're refactoring your table structures and things like that, it's not like you've got to go back and add date fields or modify anything. Until you get to the end, you can then just add the subscriptions on. And as we see, it's very, very easy then just to move those changes down. So there's no metadata table changes that you need to make. Just really, really easy to go and run. So let's get straight into a demo, and we'll look at the subscription language as we go through the demo, rather than just sitting through a number of slides. If you want to go and see that, then definitely have a look at the blog posts that I've done recently, and you'll be able to pick up a whole load more from there. But let's actually get into seeing this in action. So I just want to show you this this sample. We're going to see an example of this all working together. For this example, I've got a medicine database which has got 3 tables. I've got some categories, which is just categories that the medicines belong to. Some medicines themselves with some URLs where to find out more about the medicine, and then some patient advice and special warnings. So, for example, what goes onto the medicine bottle, and then a link table that just links the medicines and the categories and says which ones belong where. Now, if we have a look at the metadata here for each of the tables, we can see there's no hidden triggers or anything else behind the scenes. This is just our normal tables, exactly as we define them up normally. With the database, however, we have created a subscription. This subscription was created by running create subscription, the subscription name on the categories, and then where we want it to subscribe to. So on categories for row insert updates and deletes. And then you just comma separate additional tables in. So medicine for row insert update and deletes, and then medicine categories for all of the changes. And we could have defined specific fields that we wanted to track. So if we've been brackets in here, we could define specific fields in the medicine table that we wanted to track rather than just tracking everything. But here we're just tracking all 3 tables in their entirety. That's about it. So once we've got the subscription in, you then grant subscribe on subscription to a specific role or user, and then they are then able to subscribe to that data. So from my pharmacy database here, I can see that I've got the same tables. In fact, I've got some more tables because there's other stuff that we're doing at the pharmacy level. But we've just basically done a simple mirror of the tables, the medicine table, the medicine categories, and the category one. So let's now come away from IB Console for a moment, and I'm going to open up and, in fact, let's run it, see it in action, and then we'll jump in and have a look at the code underneath. So I've got 2 example databases here. Pharmacy 1, which points to a database that's got P1 as its database, and then Pharmacy 2 that points to P2. And here we can see we're starting at the same point. We've got our data in here. We can go and see what our customers are. We can see we've got different data with different customers here. And I'm just going to go to this data update tab just to go fetch the deltas. So my delta server is this database here. And I'm just going to go and fetch the deltas. And I can see nothing's been returned at the moment for any of the tables. It's completely up to date on both sites. So I'm going to just jump into my machine that's hosting my live database here with InterBase XE7 on. And again, it's exactly the same database. I'm just going to come in here and edit some of this data. Let's clean this up, get rid of these 3s. And let's just commit and refresh. Now back here, if I go and fetch deltas, we can now see that there's some deltas coming back. So I'm going to leave this as it is on this side for the moment, because this is identification at a row level. And today this is exactly what we can achieve with XE7, with RAD Studio XE7 and app method 1.15. We get the row level deltas back. But we've got some really cool stuff that's coming through with the next release of RAD Studio. So I'm just going to hit the Show Merged option. And what this is going to do is we're going to use a FireUI mem table underneath to read the local table and basically copy that in. And then we're going to take the deltas and apply the deltas that are fetched directly to this delta table. So if I go fetch deltas here, and we can see that this is all the same, but under this table here, we can see that these two fields here are in bold because they're the ones that we've just gone and changed. Nothing else is in bold. So at field level, we'll be able to track exactly what's changed, and we can then commit those changes into the local database. If we had a record that had been deleted on the server, then that would go red here because we know that record's been deleted. Now this makes it super easy because currently with RAD Studio XE7, I would recommend creating 2 subscriptions, one for insert and update and one for delete, so you can then query what's been deleted easily, remove those records, and then the other stuff is just the inserts and updates, which makes it very easy to separate the operations that you do with your Delta management. But this is pretty cool, so I'm just going to post the changes in here, and we can now see that if I fetch the deltas now with the merged on as well, there's nothing being highlighted, it's all completely up to date. I could go back and change something else again in the central database. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go and change something on the categories. We're just going to change this to category. And now down here, if I just go and fetch the deltas, we can see those are still there waiting for me, but also this new one in the categories table. And I can now post those in, and we're all up to date locally. So that's really, really cool. Let's have a look at the code underneath this. So the main magic really is happening, I've got on these 2 data modules. My first data module is literally my connection to my local database, where I have my query for my category. It's just providing the local data, my medicines, and then the pharmacy data, the customers. So this is all the local data connections. And then on the Delta, we then actually do a fresh connection to the local data directly at each of the tables. The local one here actually has got kind of lookup information kind of hooked into it, so it's not the great query to use for the merging. So here I just do a direct query of the table that I run my select statement in, and we'll have a look at that code underneath it in a second. And then I've got a transaction here which we connect up to at runtime to the remote data connection, and that remote data connection we then activate our subscription within our transaction. So the option here is we've put this as a rollback transaction in snapshot mode, so we have to physically commit to roll it forward. And then here we run the same query exactly on the remote database as the local one, and then we use the mem table here just to merge the data. So the way that's done, when we create this data module, we pass in the local and remote databases. We set the transaction up to the remote one, and as we see, we set up the query so they're both running exactly the same query locally and remotely. We then open all of the tables, And we do that in specific order. So the first thing we do is we make sure that we're putting cached updates on. We do that just so we can actually merge directly into that at the end. We then are able to just check that we're not in an active transaction. If we are, we just roll back and we restart the transaction. We then set the subscription and the subscription name at the specific device ID active. And that runs inside the transaction. And we execute that query. And we then open the Delta queries, which are then just fetching the Delta changes from the remote database. If we have show merged ticked, which is that tick box on the form, we then use this new feature of FireUI called merge dataset, which allows us to merge this dataset into this mem table. And then there's a number of merge dataset modes which we can use. So here we just tell it it's a dataset and we just want to throw it in. And then into that memory table, we then apply the delta merge, which is the deltas from the remote table. So that then just applies those changes directly into that memory table. From the screen, when we post the deltas, then it's literally this. We just merge the data sets again into the local query and then apply the updates. And then we commit the transaction. That is as simple as it is to update the local data table for inserts, updates and deletes at a field level with the new stuff that we've got coming through for FireUI and change views. So just before we finish, I actually want to show you what you can do with RAD Studio XE7 and app method today, right now, if you need to use change views and you can't wait for the new stuff that's coming. Well, simply, this is exactly the same method that we've been looking at here, the post deltas. Everything else in this project is exactly the same, apart from this method, which has got this quite large inline process here, which basically takes the local data and the delta data, and then we just do a location of the record and then update the field if the field value is not the same. So if the field value is not the same, then we make sure the data set's in edit mode, update the value, and then if it's in edit mode, we're able to post those changes through. And that's something you can do, pretty straightforward. If you do want to do that today, then obviously you'd probably want to have a separate subscription for inserts and updates compared to deletes, because then it's a lot easier to identify the deleted records from the data set that you get sent back. And a lot of people actually may want to, in real world, run two separate subscriptions, one just for the deleted records and one for the inserts and updates, so they can help identify the differences. And we are adding some language into InterBase to mean that you can do that through SQL as well in the future, but that's something that will be coming through in one of the upcoming updates. So in terms of resources, then .wiki, .embarcadero.com, InterBase has its own .wiki there, and there's a great section on change views in the .wiki. Also additionally, have a look at the blog that I've done. If you have a look at, I've got a tag for change views, and that's got a number of posts in there looking at what a change view is, creating a change view and using those change views. There's some additional posts that are going up on the community site as well. So do kind of keep an eye out for those. Also, we had the first look event at the recent Code Rage. There's a great example of change views running through in that session as well. Now, I just want to give a quick shout out before we finish to the next Developer Skills Sprint, which is going to be on March the 10th. And we're going to be having a look at some of the great stuff around Bluetooth, but particularly proximity awareness with beacons. So that's something you really don't want to miss out on. Some great preview of new capabilities coming in to make life a lot easier with the next major release of the RAD tools. So now it really is time for some Q&A.
Sean asked if InterBase To Go or IB To Go supports change views.
Yeah, so currently the release version of InterBase to go is still XE3. We got the InterBase XE7 server out as our priority, which we included additional support for Linux with 64-bit and introduced Ubuntu as well as a supported platform. Yeah, the guys are just working through getting the to-go edition for XE7 out, and as soon as it is out, then yes, it will be supporting change views. It will be supported for both sides. And we see this as a very key feature for not only being able to track what changes need to go out to remote devices, but also on a remote device being able to track what changes have been made locally in the application. So again, you don't have to do all that additional work. You can just go find what needs to go back to the central server and push it back.
And then I should extend the question maybe and ask, are change views part of IB Lite?
So we're not planning to have it as part of IB Lite. Change views is one of our kind of premium features, which is part of the to-go packaging.
Okay. Alpha's asking, does any other database management system, SQL databases, have something like change views?
Yeah, but no, but yeah, but no, but and certainly no is the definitive answer. Change views is actually kind of, it costs a lot of money to do a software patent, and we've been in the process of doing that for some while now with interface change views. We're really excited by what this brings to the market as a new way to be able to track changes. There are some capabilities with SQL Server, and I believe Oracle has some capabilities where you can actually get notification if a record has been modified whilst you're connected to the server in session. So if you're running a transaction and you select a specific record, if it's modified elsewhere, that you can get notification. But that's a very different type of technology and requires a connection. This is about being very restful and coming back later on and saying, hey, anything changed in my cache, so I can literally update my local data set to be able to go off doing my remote distributed work again, which is a very different type of paradigm.
Bruce asked, does submerged dataset also work with client dataset deltas, or is it just for use with FireDAC?
So what I've shown here is an update to FireDAC. There are also some updates that have been made to the IBX components, which I've got to still work through. But there will be, the example that I've shown today will be with the next major release of the RAD tools, and I'm hoping to kind of get an IBX example of how that kind of stuff works as well out with that.
And David's making, I guess it's sort of a comment with a frowny face. I realize you are also a database company with InterBase, and something like this looks like a big advantage. However, it'll be of little use to any poor people who are stuck with other database engines through company policy.
Well, it's kind of funny you say that, David. I've actually just been working recently on a proof of concept for a customer who's a pharmacy customer, and they have a real need to be able to get the drug information distributed out to, they've got about 30,000 connected pharmacies, and they currently are using Microsoft SQL Server on the back end, and we've actually showing them an example, and this example that you've just seen here was actually started from building for them, where they can actually merge locally just by doing a record-by-record compare their data from the SQL Server database into InterBase, and then being able to use their connection to the central InterBase data to find the updates that they need to bring down to the local site. So actually making it part of the architecture, not without, not by replacing something that's being used elsewhere, but being able to actually use that as a central update mechanism, so they update it in one place, but then that then produces all the delta definitions for going out to all the different remote sites, which is pretty cool.
If I understand correctly, that means it could be used a lot for cross-platform data synchronization over the Internet. Changes in a mobile device could be determined by the OS X or Windows versions, and we can work on the deltas. Would that be one approach to sync?
Yeah, so the key thing here is that you've got a set of data somewhere that you want to keep updated elsewhere. And the whole point of this is that you can subscribe multiple different devices using multiple different users, or just one user with lots and lots of different devices. And then that then in the engine gives you the ability to pick up what's changed for that specific person, which is kind of pretty cool. There's some other database engines out there on the market today that provide the ability, whilst you've got a connection open, to be able to pick up what's changing, so you can update the remote data. But nothing that spans connections. The new stuff that we're doing with change views is patent pending. It's kind of, really is a very new way of being able to do this kind of mobile world today kind of way of getting data out to different kind of places, which is kind of really, really exciting.
Great, and if you have questions, now is the time to type it into the Q&A window. Now let me go through a couple more questions. So there is a way to act on the data before going through the DM delta merge operations. Should we need to analyze and eventually change some data before merging the data sets?
Yeah, so it's basically using architecture that's already in FireDAC for moving, like picking up the deltas. So it's just a way to be able to get those and move them down somewhere and then merge that delta in. I quite like the new way of being able to merge it in. It's quite elegant.
Great, and there's another question. Is the slideshow available for download?
Yes, the slides I have I can make available. So yeah, I'll find some way to get them up and get that shared out to everybody. Not a problem.
Yeah, a great way.
I'll make sure they've got a link directly.
And I think a great way would be on our community site, community.embarcadero.com. You could create a blog post and add a slide share deck to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's one more question. And again, if you have questions, type it into the Q&A. We have a couple minutes here to answer your questions. Is this only on InterBase, or can it be done with MySQL?
Okay, so the whole change view technology is something that is unique to InterBase. Yeah, it's it's actually quite interesting because I've been working on a proof of concept recently with a pharmacy customer where they've got 30,000 pharmacies across their region that they need to keep updated, specifically with drug information. That when there's a change, obviously the patient advice you're giving out is pretty critical to make sure that that's correct. And their infrastructure at the moment works on Microsoft SQL Server. And what they're looking to do now is actually to add an InterBase server to their central architecture. And that server is literally going to have the subset of data they need to get out the drug information. And they're going to use a really simple technique of loading up the data from the tables in the SQL Server database and then doing a compare merge and pasting that into the InterBase database. And that then produces all the deltas for all the different pharmacies, because they're all subscribed to the InterBase database to pick up the changes. And then by doing that, they're then able to now dramatically reduce their costs of getting data out to all these different sites. And also, currently they've got an issue where they have to take everybody offline to be able to do the updates to the database. And it's something they're going to be able to do online now as well, which is pretty cool.
Do you have pricing on InterBase for clients?
Yeah, absolutely we do. The pricing for the to-go edition is a fraction of what it is for the server stuff. There's also some great OEM deals if you're looking to do volume. Best thing to do, Richard, is get in touch with your local sales rep and they'll be able to help you through making sure that you find the right deal. Or feel free to email me through stephen.ball, Stephen with a PH, .ball at embarcadero.com. And I'll be more than happy to help make sure you get in contact with the right person.
And with me on the line is Sriram Balasubramaniam, I hope. Sriram, there was the first question, Vladimir asked, how smooth is the transition from InterBase XE3 to XE7?
For smooth, I think the question might be related to how easy is it to take your XE3 database and use it in XE7, right? So in that case, your database files that are usable on XE3 are also usable on XE7. The easiest migration, of course, that we recommend, the recommended migration is just back up your database and restore it in XE7. The one thing that you would want to know, though, is InterBase XE3 supported ODS versions or on-disk structure versions from version 11 to 15, whereas InterBase XE7 supports it from ODS 13 to ODS 16. We have a new version of ODS in XE7. So if you have databases with ODS 13 and or 15 back in InterBase XE3, those files you don't even have to back up and restore. They are usable as is. But if you want to, if you have databases that are older ODSs like ODS 10, 11, or 12, you would want to back up and restore them in InterBase XE7. That said, InterBase XE7 enables a bunch of new features, one of which you saw today with regard to change views. Change views and a couple of other features are available only in the newer ODS that InterBase XE7 supports, and for that you will need to have ODS 16. The way you can get that is just back up your old database or your database from InterBase XE3 and restore it in InterBase XE7, and you will get ODS 16 right out of the box. One additional benefit I would want to say, in InterBase XE7 we have enabled new support for you to restore your databases to an older version if you wanted to do that. So for example, say you have an InterBase XE3 database which is ODS 15, and you want to continue using ODS 15, but you want to do a backup and restore of the database. Now in older versions of InterBase, once you restored the database to that version, you always got the latest ODS, irrespective of what your older ODS was. In InterBase XE7, we have made it a little bit more flexible for you to sort of test your features out and test your installation. So you can back up your old database from XE3 and restore it to ODS 13 or 15 in InterBase XE7 if you choose to do that. Now, of course, that support is available both in a command line version of JBack Restore or even the services API that's available. But of course, our recommendation is always just restore it by default, and you will get the latest ODS, which is ODS 16, and all of the new features that go along with that. So to answer to make it a little bit of a short answer, I would say just back up and restore your database and you should be good to go.
If I have an existing Delphi XE7 and or C++ Builder XE7, and I want to use InterBase XE7, even if separate from change views, I just use the same application, is that right? Just make sure I have the right InterBase installed and the drivers installed, client driver?
Absolutely. The InterBase client library is backward compatible. So if you have a database that you have been developing with Delphi XE7 or C++ Builder XE7, you can just copy those database files or into a new installation of InterBase XE7 and just start using it with that. You don't need to really make any modifications to your application. The old InterBase client library from your Delphi XE7 application will continue to work with newer InterBase servers that are either installed on a remote system, or you have to just change your database URL to connect to the new database instance. That's all.
One thing Stephen said, if you want to use the change views, you need either the InterBase XE7, desktop edition, server edition, developer edition, or to go, but not IB Lite, right?
Right. Well, as of today, the initial release of InterBase XE7 was only released for Windows and Linux platforms, and those were the server-based editions of the product.
Okay.
We are working on a schedule to release the to-go editions and the IB Lite support for InterBase XE7, and that should be getting released fairly soon. And the support for that is also going to be built into RAD XE8 or the next release of RAD Studio as it's going to come out. So change views, as Stephen mentioned, is going to be supported in more natively in the upcoming version of RAD Studio, and it will have better integrated support for change views. But InterBase XE7 to-go edition, which supports a lot more platforms, Mac OS X, iOS, Android, and Windows, of course. So we are going to enable all of these features in InterBase 2 Go edition in an upcoming release very soon. The change view support is available on all editions of InterBase, but for IB Lite. IB Lite will not have change view support, but it's available on InterBase 2 Go edition and all the server-based editions.